Winter fog drifts across the University of Tennessee campus in Knoxville, transforming familiar walkways into ghostly corridors. The distant hum of a security golf cart echoes through the mist, its headlights cutting pale beams through the darkness. A streetlight flickers near the edge of the grounds, casting intermittent shadows that dance across empty pathways where students once walked with carefree certainty. But on this January night in 1995, that certainty has vanished. Students huddle in whispered clusters outside dormitory doors, their voices carrying fragments of rumors too terrible to fully believe. Something has happened. Something that has shattered the illusion of safety that every campus community depends upon. Police cordons stretch across a quiet corner of the university grounds, yellow tape fluttering in the cold wind like prayer flags marking sacred ground. Officers move with the tense urgency of those who have seen what cannot be unseen, their breath visible in the frigid air as they work under the harsh glare of portable spotlights. The sudden death of a young student has sent shockwaves through this tight-knit community, but the true horror lies not in the tragedy itself, but in what the investigation would soon reveal. It was a crime that began with a promise of peace and ended with a sentence no one saw coming, one that would make headlines across the nation and forever change how America viewed youth and justice. This is the horrifying true story of Christa Gail Pike. To understand how this darkness found its way onto a college campus, we must first journey into the troubled childhood of Christa Gail Pike, whose story begins not with violence, but with the kind of instability that leaves deep scars on a developing mind. Born in West Virginia and raised in small-town Tennessee, Pike's early years were marked by the chaos that comes when the adults meant to provide stability become sources of uncertainty instead. Those who knew her described a girl of sharp intelligence and quick wit, someone who could charm teachers and manipulate situations to her advantage. But beneath that surface charisma lay an unpredictable temperament, a volatility that could shift from laughter to rage without warning. Her relationship with her mother was fractured by neglect and emotional distance, while the absence of a stable father figure left her searching for validation in all the wrong places. Pike moved between households like a ghost haunting different lives, never quite belonging anywhere. These periods of abandonment and neglect created a young woman desperate for connection yet terrified of rejection. She formed intense attachments quickly, pouring all her emotional energy into relationships that often soured just as rapidly. Each disappointment added another layer to her growing resentment toward a world she felt had consistently failed her. This pattern of instability followed Pike into young adulthood, therefore leading her to the Job Corps program in Knoxville, a federal training program designed to give disadvantaged youth a second chance. It was here, in 1994, that Pike's path would cross with that of Colleen Slemmer, a 19-year-old from Florida who had come to Tennessee seeking the same opportunities for a better life. The Job Corps campus became Pike's new social world, a complex ecosystem of friendships and rivalries where young adults from troubled backgrounds tried to reinvent themselves. But Pike's pattern of intense relationships followed her here, and what began as typical dormitory dynamics soon escalated into something far more sinister. Personal disagreements over boys, perceived slights, and social hierarchies began to consume her thoughts. Pike's resentment toward Colleen Slemmer grew like a poisonous vine, fed by jealousy and what she perceived as deliberate provocations. Rather than seeking healthy ways to resolve these conflicts, Pike began to surround herself with a small circle of followers who validated her grievances and encouraged her darkest impulses. The social dynamics of the Job Corps, meant to foster growth and opportunity, instead became an incubator for Pike's growing obsession with settling scores permanently. January 12, 1995, dawned like any other winter day on the Knoxville campus. Students shuffled through their morning routines, grabbing breakfast in the cafeteria, walking to training workshops, engaging in the casual chatter that fills any educational environment. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, tension simmered between Pike and Slemmer, manifesting in sharp words and lingering hostility that others began to notice. The animosity between the two young women had reached a breaking point. Therefore, Pike made what would prove to be a fateful decision. She approached Slemmer with a proposition. They should meet that evening to talk things through and make peace. It was a gesture that, on the surface, seemed mature and reasonable, exactly the kind of conflict resolution the Job Corps program encouraged. But as evening shadows lengthened across the campus, Pike's true intentions began to reveal themselves. She led Slemmer away from the dormitories and training facilities, toward an isolated area where the streetlights thinned out and the comforting sounds of campus life faded into silence. The sound of shoes on gravel echoed through the cold air as they walked deeper into darkness, each step taking them further from safety and closer to an act that would change both their lives forever. The atmospheric tension of that winter night, the fog rolling in, the distant sounds of the campus settling into evening quiet, the sense of isolation growing with each passing moment, created the perfect setting for tragedy. Slemmer, perhaps sensing something amiss but unable to articulate her fears, followed Pike into what would become her final moments. When investigators began reconstructing the events of that night, they uncovered a chilling pattern of premeditation that contradicted Pike's later claims of spontaneous violence. The evidence they discovered painted a picture of careful planning rather than a sudden outburst of rage. Witness statements revealed that Pike had made disturbing comments in the days leading up to the murder, speaking about wanting to hurt Slemmer and asking others to participate in her plans. Physical evidence found at the scene and in Pike's possession told the story of someone who had come prepared for violence. Items she carried that night, the route she had chosen, and the timing of the attack all pointed to a methodical approach that investigators found deeply unsettling in someone so young. This wasn't the impulsive act of a teenager overwhelmed by emotion. It was the calculated execution of a plan that had been forming in Pike's mind for weeks. Court testimony and psychological evaluations would later explore the possible motives behind Pike's actions. Jealousy certainly played a role, as did Pike's desperate need to assert control and dominance over her social environment. But perhaps most disturbing was the sense that Pike viewed violence as a viable solution to interpersonal conflict, a mindset that suggested a fundamental disconnect from normal moral reasoning. The break in the case came not through sophisticated detective work, but through Pike's own inability to contain her satisfaction over what she had done. In the hours and days following Slemmer's murder, Pike's behavior became increasingly erratic and suspicious. She made comments to other students that revealed knowledge only the perpetrator could possess, and her demeanor struck witnesses as unnaturally calm for someone whose classmate had just died violently. These witness accounts began to form a pattern that investigators couldn't ignore. Pike's timeline of events didn't match the physical evidence, and her emotional responses seemed calculated rather than genuine. The pivotal moment came when multiple witnesses came forward with similar stories about Pike's behavior and statements, creating a web of evidence that pointed directly to her involvement. What made the case even more compelling to investigators was Pike's apparent pride in what she had done. Rather than showing remorse or attempting to distance herself from the crime, she seemed to relish the attention and fear her actions had generated among her peers. This psychological profile of someone who derived satisfaction from violence would prove crucial in understanding both the crime and the perpetrator. When news of Colleen Slemmer's murder and Pike's arrest broke across East Tennessee, the community's reaction was one of profound disbelief. The idea that an 18-year-old girl could be capable of such calculated violence challenged fundamental assumptions about gender, youth, and the nature of evil itself. Local news anchors delivered updates in hushed, almost reverent tones, as if speaking too loudly might somehow make the reality more unbearable. The story quickly transcended regional boundaries, therefore national media outlets seized upon the sensational elements of the case. Headlines screamed across newspaper front pages and television screens. Teenage killer stalks campus. Murder among students. Youngest woman facing death row. The case seemed to tap into deep-seated fears about youth violence and the breakdown of social order, fears that had been growing throughout the 1990s. Public fascination with the case was matched only by the horror it inspired. Community members struggled to reconcile the image of Pike as an intelligent young woman with the brutal reality of her actions. The case sparked intense debates about rehabilitation versus punishment, about whether someone so young could truly be beyond redemption, and about the role of the death penalty in cases involving juvenile offenders. Media coverage often focused on the most sensational aspects of Pike's personality and crime, sometimes losing sight of the human cost represented by Colleen Slemmer's death. The victim, who had come to Tennessee seeking a better life, became a footnote in many accounts that focused primarily on the spectacle of Pike's trial and sentencing. The scene outside the courthouse when Pike was taken into custody resembled something from a Hollywood thriller rather than real life in Knoxville, Tennessee. Media cameras lined the sidewalks, their lenses trained on every doorway and window like mechanical vultures waiting for their prey to emerge. Reporters jostled for position, their voices creating a cacophony of questions and commentary that echoed off the courthouse walls. When Pike finally appeared, flanked by law enforcement officers, the assembled crowd fell into an expectant hush, broken only by the rapid-fire clicking of camera shutters. Witnesses later described her demeanor as unnaturally composed, almost serene, as if she were attending a routine appointment rather than facing charges that could end her life. This apparent lack of emotion struck observers as profoundly disturbing, reinforcing the image of someone fundamentally different from ordinary people. During her interrogation, Pike's statements to police revealed a personality that seemed to exist outside normal moral boundaries. Excerpts from these sessions, while carefully sanitized for public consumption, showed someone who spoke about the murder with a detachment that chilled seasoned investigators. Her tone remained conversational, her self-presentation almost casual, as if she were discussing the weather rather than the taking of a human life. These moments of public exposure shaped perception of Pike in ways that would prove difficult to overcome during her trial. The image of a cold, calculating killer had been established in the public mind. Therefore, her defense team faced an uphill battle in presenting any narrative that might generate sympathy or understanding for their client. The courtroom during Pike's trial felt like a pressure cooker ready to explode. Every creak of the wooden chairs, every rustle of papers, every whispered consultation between attorneys seemed amplified in the tense silence that pervaded the proceedings. The weight of the case, not just the brutal murder of a young woman, but the unprecedented prospect of sentencing another young woman to death, hung over everyone present like a physical presence. The prosecution built their case methodically, presenting evidence of premeditation and Pike's apparent satisfaction with her actions. They painted a picture of someone who had planned and executed murder with a coldness that belied her youth, arguing that age should not shield someone from the full consequences of such calculated evil. Their narrative was compelling in its simplicity. Pike was a predator who had lured an innocent victim to her death and deserved society's ultimate punishment. The defense faced the nearly impossible task of humanizing Pike without minimizing the horror of her crime. They presented expert testimony about her troubled childhood, her psychological makeup, and the factors that might have contributed to her violent behavior. Mental health professionals testified about personality disorders and the effects of childhood trauma, attempting to provide context for actions that seemed inexplicable to ordinary people, But the jury's reaction to Pike herself proved most telling. Throughout the trial, she maintained the same unsettling composure that had characterized her public appearances, showing little emotion even when testimony described the brutal details of Colleen Slemmer's final moments. This apparent indifference to the gravity of her situation may have sealed her fate more definitively than any evidence presented by either side. When the jury returned with their verdict and sentence recommendation, the courtroom fell into a stillness so profound that the sound of the air conditioning system seemed deafening. The foreman's voice, reading the sentence that would make Pike the youngest woman on death row in the modern era, carried across the room with the finality of a tombstone inscription. The date was March 30, 1996, and at just 20 years old, Christa Pike had earned a place in the annals of American criminal history. The implications of Pike's case extend far beyond the specifics of one tragic night in Knoxville. Her story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the intersection of youth, violence, and justice in American society. How do we reconcile our understanding of adolescent development with the reality of calculated evil? Can someone barely out of childhood be held fully accountable for actions that seem to emerge from a fundamentally different moral universe? Pike's case arrived during a period of intense national debate about juvenile crime and punishment. The 1990s had seen a series of high-profile cases involving young offenders, leading to calls for tougher sentences and the expansion of adult court jurisdiction over juvenile cases. Pike's death sentence seemed to represent the ultimate expression of this tough-on-crime mentality, but it also raised profound questions about whether such punishment could ever truly serve justice. Over the years since her conviction, Pike's case has continued to generate controversy and legal challenges. Appeals based on her age at the time of the crime, questions about her mental competency, and evolving standards regarding the execution of those who committed crimes as juveniles have kept her story in the legal spotlight. Each new development forces society to re-examine its assumptions about punishment, rehabilitation, and the possibility of redemption. The story of Christa Pike serves as a dark mirror reflecting some of humanity's most troubling capacities. It reminds us that evil is not the exclusive domain of seasoned criminals or hardened adults, but can manifest in those who should be just beginning to discover life's possibilities. Her case challenges our fundamental beliefs about justice, mercy, and the value of human life, all human life, including that of someone who has taken life from another. As we close this examination of one of America's most disturbing criminal cases, we are left not with easy answers, but with haunting questions that continue to resonate decades later. The story of Christa Pike is a reminder that the darkest chapters in human nature can be written at an age when life should just be beginning, and that some stories have no neat conclusions, only the echoing questions they leave behind.